very complimentary towards us, but Tom has taught us as much as we've done for him. He made a statement in one of our small groups once that probably had more profound impact on me in this process of starting this church than anything I've heard. And he said, when we were in that small group and we were sitting there studying God's Word, and we were sharing our burdens with each other and talking and telling our stories to each other and weeping together and laughing together and sharing that life experiences together, he said, and he's been to some very large corporate churches, and he said, this is more like church than anything I've ever experienced. And being the traditionalist that I formerly was, I thought that sounded sacrilegious. I thought he was, how dare you refer to a room where we're sitting eating pizza as the Holy of Holies, the house of the Lord. And then as God started to change my heart and mind, I started to think a lot about what he said. And we don't get to, in this environment, we praise the Lord and we celebrate what he's done for us. But in reality, the things that we do in those small groups and in those life groups together is where you're going to make those big gains and growths. Now, be patient with us. We're still getting ours off the ground. We're not even a year old. So if that's something that you'd like to help with, please let us know. If you want in one of those groups, I don't even know how the app works. But apparently you can use the app to find them. But we're going to help you, and we're going to figure this out together, and we're going to get this thing going, because I'm telling you, in those moments, you will see lives change. All right, so let's recap just a little bit. And this actually plays into the message for today. But let's recap a little bit. A couple of weeks ago, we started talking about Jonah. And the word of the Lord came to Jonah. And the word of the Lord was, go preach to Nineveh and tell them that the sins they're committing, those sins of mockery against the laws of God, are coming up into my face, God says. And so he wants Jonah to go and tell them. But Jonah is living in the Mediterranean. He's living in this breadbasket of economic success that was the Mediterranean in the 8th century BC. And so he's very comfortable. He has lots of convenience in his life. And God's asking him to go to Nineveh, which is this giant city in the middle of the Assyrian Empire in a time when they were on their economic downturn, and the only people they were trading with are the people they were extorting for goods. And so it's dangerous. They were killing people. They were putting them to death. They were doing these mutilations. They were horrible. They were sacrificing babies. They were just doing horrible things. Jonah ended up saying, you know what? I've got a better plan. I'll get a ticket and I'm heading to Tarshish, which is on the southern tip of Spain, 2,500 miles away, and he ends up getting out of there. He's on the boat, and we learned about the boat last week and all the valuable cargo and how all the rubies and the gold and the things that were on this boat, and how this storm that God hurled at them was so bad and so catastrophic that it caused these seasoned sailors to take this valuable load that may have cost them their livelihoods. It may have cost them, they may have been sold into bondage after that, to throw that out into the sea. And we made the point first week, what is your Nineveh? What are you running from? Week 2, we asked the question, do you believe that you sin in isolation? And the answer to that is no. We talked about that it cost so many people so much because of his sin. Well, this week, if I were to name this message, I think we would call it Your Story in the Storm. Your Story in the Storm. And we're going to pick up in verse 7 of Jonah chapter 1. And it says, then the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity. Now, I did a little research into casting lots because I've read that my whole life, and when I've studied the Bible and in Sunday school, they casted lots. I didn't know what that was. So I looked it up. And the reality is there's a lot of debate among historians on what actually casting lots was. But the closest thing that we use in modern times is, if you watched the Tennessee football game yesterday, you saw them flip a quarter before the game. And they flip a quarter to decide who's going to get the ball first. And that's kind of the idea behind lots. The only thing is that in the ancient world, there was a belief that, even among the pagans, that the gods controlled the outcome of that random flip. So what we think happened is that each person on the boat that was sitting around there in this discussion was given a token of some kind. Now, when I think about that, I think about like when you play Monopoly. You know how you get the race car or the thimble or something like that? Each person was assigned their own little token, and then they put it into a cup or a bowl, and they shook it up and down until one piece flew out. When the one piece flew out, that was the person and their token that was identified. So that's the closest thing I could find to an explanation of what this was. But we know this happened in throughout the Bible. In the book of Leviticus, they used casting of lots to determine whose job was going to be whose in the tabernacle. So which priest did which job, they casted lots. We saw the Roman soldiers cast lots for Jesus' clothes at the crucifixion. We also saw the casting of lots. The disciples decided who was going to replace Jesus by casting of lots. So we see it throughout the Bible, but really that's what I came up with research this week. So the important part for our story is the lots pointed to Jonah. Jonah was the one who was the culprit causing all of this trouble. So they come, let us cast lots into who's responsible for this calamity. They cast the lots and the lot fell on Jonah. Then it came to this. On verse 8, it says, so they asked him, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? So, one of the things that I did, and as most of y'all know, I'm a physical therapist. In my office, before it was over here in the lab, was before over in the hospital, and it was right next to the emergency room waiting room. And I'm going to tell you folks that when I sat there and worked next to that waiting room of that emergency room for about 10 years, over that 10-year period, I heard a lot of people asking some of these same questions of the Lord. Why? They don't even know who they're praying to. They're going, who? God, why? Why is this happening to my child who's been hit by the car, or somebody's sick, or they've had a massive heart attack, or whatever? We've heard those people cry out those questions and want to identify what is the cause, what is the meaning. But not only that, but if you've ever studied philosophy, the ancient philosophers of Plato and Aristotle, they wrote volumes on standing looking into the stars and over the sea and over the mountains and asking the question, who are we? And what are we about? And why am I here? So there's all of these questions in a storm that people ask. And we see that here, and we see that this thing. But they're also wanting to know who this God is. If Jonah's God, and remember in the previous verses we saw where they were asking, which God is it? We're praying to all of them. They were just throwing out a Hail Mary to all the gods and trying to figure out to appease one of them, surely, and we'll get off the hook. But I think it's important for us to take a second and look at some of the gods that were worshipped in the 8th century BC around the Mediterranean region. The first one that I want to talk about is one that if you've read the Bible very much, you're probably pretty familiar with, and that's Baal. So this is a statue of Baal in a museum. Now, one of the things that you notice about Baal is his hands up in the air. Now, something's broken off, but historically, what would have been seen was a lightning bolt, because Baal was the master of the heavens, the god of the storm, the god of the wind. I want you to notice the irony of this situation that God has put these sailors and Jonah in regards to their prayers to their gods. They're in a storm that God, our Heavenly Father, hurled at them, and they're worshiping a little statue of a guy holding a lightning bolt who's supposed to be the God of the heavens. The second one I want to show you, and here's some more irony for you, is Yam. Now, I don't know if you can tell, this is kind of a blurry picture, but Yam was often portrayed as a sea creature or a giant fish. See some irony there? Yeah. So Yam was the god of the sea. So the sailors would have been very familiar with the god of the sea. So here we go. We see Yam. But he's, in case you can't tell what's happening in this picture, it's a giant fish swallowing people who are in the sea. Kind of interesting. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is another one you may recognize, Dagon. Now Dagon looks like the dad of the Little Mermaid, but he is half fish and half man, and you may recognize him because he was also the god that the Philistines worship. And if you remember in 2 Samuel chapter 5, when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, they took it back to their land and they put it in the temple of Dagon, and they set this. If you remember, the Ark of the Covenant is the indwelling of God. It's what they put in the Holy of Holies that allowed them to come into the presence of God. So this was a terrible, terrible defeat for the Israelites. So they put this into Dagon's temple, and there was a statue of Dagon in this temple. And they put it in there, and they shut it up, and they said, boy, we had a great day and a great victory. And they walk out, and the next morning they come back, and the statue of Dagon's on his face before the ark. He's laying on his face in front of the ark. Well, they think, this is just a happenstance. So they stand Dagon back up, they prop him back up a little better, and they walk out again. The next day they come back, and Dagon's laying on his face again in front of the ark, but this time both of his hands are broken off and his head is broken off. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. And this is the gods. This is them. This is who these guys are hollering to. Now there was a bunch of them, but these are just three that I wanted to kind of isolate out and show you the irony of this story and what God is going to do in Jonah's life and in the lives of these sailors. See, the thing we have to understand is that when you're in these storms, look for the opportunities to share with others. They're an opportunity. There are going to be people who are going to come to Christ because of your story. And we're going to see that here. Now, if we go on to verse 9, we see he answered. And this is Jonah's answer. Because remember, they're asking all of these questions. Jonah identifies who he is and what he's about. He answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Now, for those of you who aren't from this area, you've moved in here from somewhere else, I'm going to say something about Jonah, but I'm going to preface it with a southern term where I say, I hope y'all ain't kin to him. Because I'm going to say something bad about him. But Jonah was not a great prophet. He was not a great follower of God. He says it, but you got to remember, he's in the middle of being on the run. And we know from some stuff that he did back in Kings, 2 Kings, that he kind of missed the mark a little bit back then too. So the lesson here, I think, on this point is God can use you even when you ain't perfect. Right? So why do we not share our faith sometimes? Bill sent me a thing this morning, and it was amazing. It said that the average church person, will sing 500 songs. They're going to hear 200 messages and Bible studies in the average year. And the average Christian doesn't share their faith one time. And and I think this is a fault of churches some too. Because we don't do a good job equipping you to do that. That's why CF has started all of these classes about how to do that. My story training and all of those things so that we can help develop that in you so that you see those opportunities to share what God has brought you through. Hold on. So, but let's look back at this verse again. He answered, I am a Hebrew. So he identified his religious and national origin. He also says, and that word worship could be fear as well. It's in some translations it says fear. And I fear the Lord. And a lot of times when we say the Lord in English, we say the Lord with a capital L, and we just say that kind of generic term, Lord. But what he said in Hebrew was Jehovah. So Jonah says, he calls out the name of his God. He says, I am a Hebrew, and I worship Jehovah, the God of heaven, which is a slam on Baal, which takes away any kind of authority of Baal, and the God of the sea and the dry land, which dismantles any kind of claim into Dagon and Yam. So basically, we serve a God who identifies himself a lot of times as I am. And the beauty of the word Jehovah, the name Jehovah, it means he who exists. I am. You see, these people were struggling with identity. These sailors had no idea who they were, what their purpose was. They were lost, not just in a storm, but in their normal lives. They were lost in seeing what God had for them. So Jonah throws up this idea of here is Jehovah versus the God of heaven, who is against Baal, who's the master of the storm, which he's not. We see that time and time again when demonic forces come in the presence of the Lord, the true presence of the Lord, they have to bow down. And that is and this is what Jonah calls on. If we go to verse 10, we see their response. This terrified them, and they asked, what have you done? Now, it says here, they knew he was running from the Lord because he had already told them. Now, I think that's interesting. Jonah had shared his story. We see that. He had shared them with these guys. And I kind of thinking about that this week. I was driving down the road and I was thinking about how Jonah would have shared this with those sailors. And he would have said, yeah, I'm a prophet over there and I'm on the run from my God. And men being men, these burly old salty sailors probably were like, it's all right, buddy, we're all running from somebody. And one would have said, yeah, I'm running from my God too. And another one says, I'm running from my mother-in-law. And there's just a bunch of guys talking. So they knew what Jonah had done. And they had made this connection. They had heard his story. But what's interesting about the story is that when you add the element of the storm, it mattered. You see, when you share your story with people, and you've all probably experienced this, somebody where you work, you've told them about where you've been and what you've been through. And they just kind of, they hear you and they acknowledge it. So that's nice. But whenever that storm hits in their life and that diagnosis comes through, or that death happens in the family, who do they walk past a bunch of people to come talk to at work? Hopefully it's you, because you have told them that story. They come to the one they know identifies. They come to the one, they'll find the person that they know knows who's the God of the storm. They know that they're going to find that person who is the God of the sea and the dry land and the God of heavens, the God who controls these storms. That's who they're going to go look for. And that's who they're going to go find. Now, this word terrified in verse 10 that we see here, that word is to morally revere. To morally revere. It wasn't like they just cried and they bowed down. They morally revered. When Jonah says, I fear the Lord, what he's saying is I morally revere Jehovah, which is a form of worship. So the word goes back and forth. When we morally revere God's things that he's told us to do, That's a form of worship. And you're worshiping throughout the week. You're worshiping God by being morally reverent to what He has told you to do. So, we see here that, so pay attention to verse 10, the question, what have you done? Now, it's about Jonah. They want to know about Jonah. Then let's go to verse 11. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Now, think about that. How their line of reasoning changed as the storm got worse. It went from Jonah and what's going on with Jonah and what did you do to what do we need to do? Man, that is exactly what happens when you're sharing the gospel with people. That is exactly what happens. It goes from what you did till they start to internalize it, and that's the whole point of sharing your story, is getting folks to make that connection of when you were in this storm, when you were lost, when you had all these things going on in your life, this is how God delivered you from that. Now they're hearing your story and in their heads while they're dealing in that storm, and they want to know more about how to get that storm to calm down. And so we see this progression here with Jonah. And another question sometimes that we ask ourselves, and you've got to be careful about saying this, is how could it get worse? And this storm gets worse multiple times as we read over the rest of this chapter. We're going to see very, very often that it gets worse. All right. Let's go ahead and go to verse 12. Jonah gives them the answer. Pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. So Jonah acknowledged his sin. Jonah acknowledged on the deck of this ship, guys, the reason you're going through this is my sin. I'm running from Jehovah. I'm the one who sinned against Jehovah. Y'all are paying for the price that I have done. And the only way that we're going to make this calm is for you to throw me overboard and into the sea. You know, one of the things that is really interesting about this, one of the things that that fascinates me about this story is that we realize and we see here the example that sometimes when we're in the storm, in a sin of our own making, the only way that storm is going to go away is when we die to ourselves. Jonah recognized that. Jonah recognized that the only way, because he didn't know a big fish was going to come and swallow him and give him 3 days of boat ride in a submarine. He didn't know that. He's seeing the storm of all storms, potentially the worst storm that ever hit the earth, because it was one that God cooked up just to throw and punish these people. So it's a bad storm. These waves are huge. Everybody on that boat knew that when Jonah went overboard, he was going to die. It's also a very interesting connection between Jonah and the story of the Lord Jesus, because we're about to see this connection. And Jesus, like we talked about last week, even referenced the story of Jonah later on in the New Testament, in his ministry. But we see this Jonah recognizing that he was going to have to die in order to keep this going, in order to save these folks. In verse 13, instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Now, these guys had just developed moral reverence to Jehovah. They did not want to kill the guy that God was trying to teach the lesson to. I mean, you have to understand, they're trying to think there's got to be another way. And a lot of times in almost every religion in the world, they've cooked up another way besides dying to yourself. You've got to figure out another way to do it. There's got to be a way we can work this out. Surely I don't have to come to Christ. Surely I don't have to confess my sins and admit that I'm a sinner and believe all these things. Surely that's simple, but I don't even want to do that. Surely I can just be a good person. Surely I can just work it out. Just like these sailors did, they're trying to row the boat back to the shore. They don't want to throw him overboard. So they're rowing, but it says, but they could not. The sea grew even wilder than before. And then in verse 14 we see, then they cried out to the Lord. Now this is the capital L, Jehovah. They cried out to Jehovah. Please, Lord, please, Jehovah, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man. For you, Lord, have done as you have pleased. Do you remember when we talked about unity together? Remember the message about unity that I did? And we talked about how the key to being unified with others is to be unified with Christ, and how we need to align ourselves with this. That's what these folks are saying in this last part down here. They're saying that they didn't want to kill the innocent man and they said, "Have done for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." What they're saying here is that God's will is being done. This is all being done because the Lord has willed it, and we don't want to break that and kill this guy. We don't want to go against that. So they're struggling. They're struggling because they're having these big theological questions as they're in their newfound faith that they're trying to figure out what they're going to have to do. And then if we look at verse 15, it says, then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. And the men greatly feared the Lord. There's that fear again. There's more of that moral reverence that they're having. So even in the storm, even when the storm stopped, it drew them into further and further connection with Jehovah. And they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to Him. Now, there's a lot of folks that I read as I've studied this that don't really think these guys made a true conversion. They believe they were just polytheists, and they were just worshiping that happened to be the flavor of the month God. But I'm not so sure about that. I think these guys, from what I can see, but that's my opinion, that I think they started to see and they recognized Jehovah over their fake gods as being the one true God. I'm going to go ahead and get the band to start coming back up. So they've thrown him overboard. And he's in the sea. And they see that the storm has calmed. And they start to make these sacrifices to the Lord. Verse 17 says, now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And there's that sign of Jonah that we see that we see in the New Testament that Jesus is talking about. That idea there. But I want to talk to you all today about some, as we kind of close out this morning, I feel like there's a way that we make this relevant to us today. And I've tried to do that throughout the message. But we're living in a time where people are struggling with identity. And it's been since the beginning of time. These philosophers, remember I talked about Aristotle and Plato talking about who am I? What am I here for? There's a struggle of identity. There's a lack of it. We don't know who we are. As many of you know, there was a storm that hit Georgia this past week. A young man went into a school down there and shot some folks, and they passed away. And there's some others who were wounded. And as I was sitting thinking about it this week, and I was praying about that, and I was lifting up the families of everybody involved, and I was watching a few interviews about different things, I saw one interview that just broke my heart and really convicted me heavily. But it was an interview, this young man's name that did the shooting, his name is Colt.